Everyone, I'm getting ready to carve a monogram cutting board here, so what I'm doing is getting my image ready for transfer on the wood. So I printed this out in poster mode as a PDF, and now I'm just taping together all the different sheets of the poster, making sure not to get any tape where my ink is, because anywhere where there's tape will not transfer the image to the board. So from here, what I'm going to do is just cut out my image and then create center lines on my board here so that I know exactly where the center of the board is, and so I can position my image nicely. So what I'm doing here is just taping down the image, trying to get it as flat as possible. You could see that the center of that image did not really tape very well, and I couldn't really get a piece of tape in there without screwing up where the image was. So here what I'm doing is a lacquer thinner transfer method, where the toner of the ink from a laser printer will transfer using lacquer thinner, and I'm using a spoon to burnish it onto the wood, just rub it down really hard. I'm using way too much lacquer thinner here, which is why I don't get a very good transfer of the image, and I have to end up going in and drawing it in. And it ripped right there because it wasn't taped very well. So this is what it looks like once you peel it off. It's a good way to transfer your images. You could use it for patterns and templates and all kinds of things. So now I'm just going through and I'm going to darken up the whole image so that I could see what parts to carve, what parts not to carve. Make sure everything transfers really well. To be honest, I could probably carve with what I have right there, but for some reason I went through and kind of drew the whole entire thing back on. I printed an extra sheet for reference there so that I could have something to look at while I was carving, while I was drawing it on there. And I just go through and darken up all my lines, make sure everything is there, make sure I can see everything, make sure it's clear. Carve this, don't carve that. Make sure all my little swirlies are in there. All that good stuff. So from here, once the image is all darkened, I'm going to go around and start doing the outlines of the image first with my small CNC bit in my trim router. You can see right here. I'm setting the depth of my bit so that I can carve. This is going to be about 3/8 of an inch deep. This is going to be filled in with epoxy, so I want to be able to have it thick enough that I can resurface this cutting board if needed. I use the ruler right there to just get a very straight line. I use it as a guide so I can drag the router, pull it down, and gives me a straight line. It's very hard to do a perfectly straight line freehand like that, so just using that as a guide helps out. I didn't realize when I was recording this, but my big fat stupid hand is right in the middle and you really can't see anything, so that's kind of pointless. I didn't even pay attention to it. It was like, just carve the stupid sign. So we go through. What I'm doing is just kind of outlining, doing all the thin stuff first, and you can see this right here is full speed of how fast it actually goes to carve it. Get an idea of how long it takes to carve one of these signs by doing this. I think the total sign carving took me about maybe 2 hours to carve it, and then a couple days on the epoxy and sanding and everything like that. But I go through and carve out everything with this small bit first, and then I'll go with a 1/8 inch downcut spiral bit and do all my clean out of the bigger areas. Here you can actually see how to carve through this. So your bit is spinning clockwise. What I try to avoid is to do a cut while the bit's spinning clockwise and going from left to right with the bit. I always try to cut going right to left. And what I find is that when you're doing what's called a climb cut into the wood, it's very hard to keep it stable and steady. Your line gets really wobbly. You go outside of it. So you may see me dragging the router through a line that's already carved left to right, but I try not to cut that way. And so here's a little close-up. You can see kind of what the lines look like. They're not perfectly straight. There's some wobbles, you know, but it's a hand-carved sign. That's what's supposed to happen. The trim routers that I'm using are just little cheap $20 Harbor Freight trim routers. I have a bunch of them. I keep a bit. I put one bit in there. I leave it alone. That way, when I need to switch routers, I just turn this one off, grab another one, turn that one on, and makes for easy carving that way. So here I've gone through and I've carved most of my thin lines. Switch this around, and I think what I'm going to do is grab another router that has a 1/8 inch downcut spiral bit in it, and we'll start hogging out all the dark areas on there that need to get all the clean out. I'm not sure what bit's in there, I couldn't see. Another thing you'll notice in this picture right here is my hand's in the way again. And another thing is I'm not wearing a dust mask. Don't do that. That's stupid. I think I was coughing for like 3 days after carving this because, you know, sometimes I get into the habit of carving and not even paying attention to safety glasses or dust mask and everything, and I pay for it later. So really, you need to wear a dust mask. Here I'm just going through. This is the 1/8 inch downcut, and I'm just going through and getting all the meat out of there. Here you can kind of see it looks like I've finished the majority of the carving, going through, brushing it off, sanding it down. And what I'll do is just double check all my line weights and thicknesses. If there's any wobbles, I'll go back in, try and smooth them out. One of the things that I try to pay attention to most is how thick the lines are, that the line is the same thickness all the way through from beginning to end of the line. And just going through and sanding it down, and I'll keep refining it, I'll keep looking at it, I'll see what needs to be corrected, what needs to be fixed. You know, maybe there's a little wobble here, or the line isn't perfect, or the circles aren't concentric, that kind of thing. So I'll go back quite a few times and fix them. I'll get some little tiny art chisels, and there you can see perfectly that those lines are not straight. But I don't think it matters. If this was done on a CNC and everything, you'd have perfectly straight lines and everything, but you know, it's a hand carved board, and I tell people that when I make them, it's like, you know, I'm not perfect, so. And here I'll go in with some chisels, and what I'm doing is just cleaning out some little bits, straighten some stuff up. I must have found another line that's not perfect, trying to clean up that line in the center. There you can kind of see I'm just taking little bits off to try and get those line weights the right thickness. Going through and doing all the touch-ups on it. Now what I'm doing here is I'm taking just a little chisel and doing all my corners and everything. It's hard to get a perfectly nice sharp corner with a round spinning bit, so I'll go through with the little chisels and just clean everything up, try and get some nice sharp lines, nice corners, things like that. Give it a good brush down, get all the loose stuff off. I do blow it off with a air compressor, but you don't see that. But here you get a better idea of what it looks like. So now all the carving is done. The next step here is we're going to get into the epoxy. And there's what I'm talking about. Just switch routers. Don't bother taking the bits out and switching them. For 20 bucks, these routers are cheap enough. If they die, so what? And they're cheap enough that I can buy 5 of them for the cost of one DeWalt router. And just leave a bit in them and switch them around. So now what we're going to do is mix up some epoxy. The color that I'm mixing up is kind of a mix between 2 different colors, like a silver and a steel gray color. And that's a color sample that I've done for the person that's going to get this color before, or this cutting board ahead of time. So mix up a little bit of epoxy. And once we do that, put the colorant in there, mix it all up, looking like it matches the sample. And you probably got about 40 minutes or so, 30 minutes to work with this epoxy before it really starts to set. So what I'm going to do here is just start to pour it in. I did not go through and seal these boards ahead of time. A lot of epoxy projects, people will go through and use either like a sanding sealer or a shellac or something like that to prevent a lot of air bubbles from releasing in the wood. But you know, for something that this thickness, I just didn't find that it was necessary. What I did find though is that I didn't mix enough epoxy, so I'm going to spread this around in there and get it all pushed in the cracks and everything like that. I noticed that it was running. My table is not perfectly level there, so I use a little chisel there to just try and wedge it up a little bit and get all that epoxy pushed down into the cracks. Hit it with a torch, get some air bubbles out of there. Try and use a little popsicle stick to push it around to get it to make sure everything is on there. Now, one of the things that happens with this epoxy is that as it cures, it's going to shrink. So I really did not put enough epoxy on there because it's going to shrink down. So I'm squeezing out the last of what I can, but I'm going to need to mix more up. Here you can kind of see how reflective and metallic it is. The epoxy gives it a real nice shine. And one of the things I forgot to do, I was so excited to do everything, is I completely forgot to videotape sanding it. I was so excited to see what the finished product was going to look like that I used my belt sander. I sanded it all off and I didn't record any of it. So this is what it looks like after you take a belt sander to it and you sand it. It's there, you could see it, but it doesn't have a whole lot of shine. You can't really see any of the reflective qualities of the epoxy or anything like that. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to step through all the grits, starting with 120 here, and just start sanding it all down. Sanding on my edges. I want everything to be equally clean. Everything's rounded over. I don't know if I actually record everything, so there you're already at 1,000 grit, so I've already skipped a few grits, but there's a pencil. What I'm doing is just keep going with this grit until I sand off all the pencil lines. Here's what I will say: after 1,000 grit, do not do the pencil, because it will take you about 2.5 hours to be able to sand it off with anything higher than 1,000 grit. So I would stop with the pencil lines at 1,000, because at this point what you're really doing is polishing more than removing material, and you're you're never going to get that pencil line off. But here we're just going through sanding it. I think we went from 1200 to 1500, and there I am using that pencil with like 1500 grit. Well, what you didn't see in between there is that 1500 grit could not get that pencil off, and I had to go all the way back down to about a 400 or 800 grit to be able to get it and then bring it back up. So here I'm about 2000, and now you could really start to see it's really polishing that epoxy quite a bit, that you can see the reflectiveness and the metallic and everything like that. Now what I'm doing here, this is 3000 grit, and that is an optical grade polishing compound that's used in automotive. And I have a polisher, and this is the first time I've ever used that polisher on this board. I've used the polishing compound on the boards before and had no problems with it, but this is made specifically for doing this. And I mean, it really made the epoxy shine. It took all the scratches. It really did a fantastic job. However, I would never do this again. What you'll see here is that compound that I'm using, even though I've used it before with no problems, using it with this polisher, I had a very hard time with it raising the grain. That big circle that you'll see, and I believe you can see in this video how it's starting to look. Let's see if I can show you. See how much shiny the epoxy is starting to look, and it's really starting to look good. But what it's doing is it's raising the grain of the wood around it while it is polishing the epoxy, and the epoxy looks fantastic. It's having the opposite effect on the wood, and I ended up having to go back and sand through all my grits again to do that. So this is one step that I would not do again, even though it made the epoxy look fantastic. It did not make the wood look fantastic. And you can kind of see it because after I finish this step, I add mineral oil to the board, and it repelled the mineral oil a bit so that it wouldn't absorb. So I did not show myself going through and sanding through all the grits, but you can probably see it when I add the mineral oil to the board that it's not taking it. But the epoxy right there looks phenomenal. Give it a quick wipe down. Here I'm kind of noticing that the grain is raised and it doesn't feel right, and while everything else looks fantastic, that was a big mistake. I shouldn't have used that polisher on there. So here we'll grab a little mineral oil, we'll squirt it around. This is a food grade mineral oil. And where that polish is completely repelled the mineral oil, which wasn't good. Go through, we'll wipe it down. I don't know if you could see that ring where the polishing compound was, but you'll be able to tell that the mineral oil would not absorb into the board where that polishing compound is. And there's me feeling it, noticing that the grain is raised, and you could see a color difference between where it was and where it wasn't. And so sometime here, I'm going to end up wiping it all down. This is the back side of the board. I went through, oiled the back side of the board. And I think when I flip it over here, I've already gone through and sanded the whole front side again and redid it. Nope, there you can get a good shot of where that stuff was. So now what I'm going to do, I have resanded it at this point, and you can see that circle kind of went away around there. I've resanded the whole thing, re-oiled the board, and this is a beeswax conditioner that I make, and I'm just going to rub that in to the whole board. And that is about it. That is the whole process of one of these, carving one of these cutting boards and filling with epoxy. The epoxy that I'm using is called art resin. It is a FDA certified food grade epoxy that can be used. So far, this is the only one that I found that is FDA certified. So I'm going to go through, wax the whole board. And that is about it for this one. So I have about 7 or 8 of these that I have to build for this one customer. So, you know, all different styles of monograms and everything. That she's going to give them away for Christmas gifts. And what I'm going to do is attach, she wanted them, I offered to make them as a 2-sided board so that if customers did not want to cut on the epoxy side, they could cut on the back side. She said no, no, no. She wants some rubber feet on the bottom of them so that they stand up, and you know, did not want to give them an option. So here's me putting the little rubber feet on. 4 little rubber feet, stainless steel screw. And that is about it. I think we have a little close-up picture of the board. We'll call that done. And that is what it looked like at the finish. All right, take care, everybody. Thanks for watching.